Thank you all for coming. My name's Edwin Rinda. I'm at the Courtauld Institute of Art. I'm super excited about this panel. It's going to be exploring some really crucial, important, urgent questions around gender and the peace process. So first up, we have Claire Pearson, Dr. Claire Pearson, who is a lecturer in gender and comparative politics at the University of Liverpool. Her research focuses on the UN Women Peace and Security Agenda, conflict transformation, and reproductive rights and activism. She is currently co-investigator on a Global Challenges Research Fund, Seed Fund project, tackling girls' and women's reproductive health through a reproductive justice framework in the Philippines and South Africa, and a unique research project funded by a coalition of Irish trade unionists addressing abortion as a workplace issue on the island of Ireland. Claire is a co-founder of the Reproductive Health Law and Policy Advisory Group. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, we thought we had a ONeill this morning, but I think Edwin, you've ruined it. But thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit today about gender and peace and security in Northern Ireland. This is a paper that is part of a special edition in the journal Capital and Class. It's a special edition on 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. I'm not sure when it's going to be coming out. I did text the editors last night to check, but I'd be happy to share the PowerPoint slides of the paper and let you all know when it comes out. So what the paper basically is saying is, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the UN Women, Peace and Security resolutions a little bit later in the talk, but what the main crux of the paper is that we need to provide a framework for the inclusion of women in peace building in Northern Ireland, and the UN Women, Peace and Security framework is there to use. And we also need to use it in order to tackle gender-based violence and gender security issues in Northern Ireland. But at the same time, we need to use a heavily contextual approach. And by that, I mean that we need to look at the structures that are impeding women from participating in peace building. Otherwise, we simply have the idea that women have the right to participate in peace building and it's their duty to include themselves, without thinking about these structures and inequalities that may stop them. And the second key point of the paper is really to think about gender as an intersecting identity. So my head of department likes to say, Claire does women and stuff. And it's the and stuff I want us to think about as well. The idea of sexuality, class, ability, disability, and how they intersect with these ethno-national and gendered identities. Because what we tend to do is exclude certain women from the process of peace building based on alternative layers to their identity outside of gender. Okay, so first of all, I'm assuming you're all here at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I would normally be in bed. You know that gender matters, but why does gender matter? Well, first of all, we know statistically that societies that have higher levels of gender inequality are much more likely to engage in violent conflict. So in the ending of conflict, if all we look at is public violence, we are more likely to re-engage in violent conflict in the future. We know that the inclusion of women in peace agreements as signatories, as participants, as being included, means that they're more likely to have longevity and they're more likely to be successful. We also know that if we think about violence as a continuum and stop breaking down these ideas of public violence and political violence and think about private violence and gender-based violence, we start breaking down these binaries. We see that when we end violent conflict, all we're ending is violent conflict in a certain sphere and for certain people. And the people who tend to be harmed by private violence and gender-based violence do tend to be women. Okay, so what are the issues then with gender and peace in Northern Ireland? We have a lack of women in peace building. So although we've seen some gains for women in formal politics, if we think about things, so for example, you won't mind me saying this, the flags, the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister Flags Commission that our keynote speaker Tom Hennessy is on, has 14 men and 1 woman. Okay, so we have, you won't mind me saying that, we have this situation where when it comes to these hard issues of security, dealing with the past, however we feel about that, women's voices aren't seen as important, they aren't seen as expert, they aren't seen as being part of that. They don't have this, we may have the, well, they weren't combatants, whether they were or weren't, the idea of who is a peace builder. We also have, and I've written quite a lot on this, the idea of power sharing and how it becomes gender exclusionary. The focus on ethno-national identity and how that means that any other policy issue either must be ethno-nationalised or ignored. And the final focus would be gender-based violence, and that would be domestic violence, sexual violence and reproductive violence. So I have some statistics. So if we think about ending violence, at the moment, we have the highest rates of sexual and domestic violence that we've had since recording began, and that is 39 domestic violent crimes reported every day, and 780 offences of rape reported last year. And if we think about the current context in reporting of sexual violence, it's likely the reporting of sexual violence may go down because people feel, why would I report sexual violence when the prosecution rate is so low? When I refer to reproductive violence, what I mean is abortion. And when I first used the term reproductive violence in an online blog article, a quite well-known anti-choice pro-lifer called me a rampant feminist who no one would ever listen to because they used the term reproductive violence. But I do think it is reproductive violence, the state-sanctioned allowance of women to travel for abortion rights is a form of violence by the state towards women. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, I don't know, on women, peace and security, it's a UN set of resolutions passed since 2000, and there are a series of them, and they really focus on, they're very short, they're about 2 sides of a page each, they're not written in heavily dense language. The idea is about women's leadership and their participation in peace building and conflict prevention. One of the most recent ones is a little bit troubling. It tends to focus women as their role in countering violent extremism, and that is a little bit problematic as it positions them as potentially informants against their communities. The later resolutions focus a lot on sexual violence in conflict. And although in Northern Ireland there was sexual violence in conflict, it's not very well documented, it's not very public, but it is starting to come to the fore. So really, if you think about how women, peace and security has been talked about in Northern Ireland, it's mostly with regard to participation. The UK government do not include Northern Ireland as part of their national action plan. They see it as an issue of foreign policy, and they don't see Northern Ireland as a foreign policy issue. There's also the issue of the idea of defining Northern Ireland as an armed conflict. Ireland does include Northern Ireland in its national action plan, and that was only after substantial lobbying from the women's sector in the north and south of Ireland. I would argue that the Women, Peace and Security framework, although it's very useful, it has a lot of issues within it. One of those would be it tends to position women as victims. So this idea, because it's heavily reliant on the language of sexual violence and conflict, there's very little room for women to be seen as active participants. Women to have agency. It also denies the role of women as combatants. They're not mentioned in that way. It also very much elides the issue of men and masculinity. It doesn't talk about who are the gatekeepers for women to access peace building spheres. What are the barriers? It doesn't deal with that idea of men, masculinity and gatekeeping. It elides certain identities. It makes no mention of LGBT women. It makes very little mention of reproductive rights, and that's something I've written a little bit about recently, the idea of displaced communities and the need for reproductive services, and why aren't we thinking about this coming out of conflict. Okay, so, before I move on, so the data I'm going to show you today was based actually on my own doctoral research from a few years ago, and some research I did at University College Dublin as a research assistant on a project that looked at the implementation of women, peace and security. And for each of these, what I'm going to talk around is, these are what I think from the, I did 25 interviews with community, women in community groups, in policing and community safety partnerships, not so much female politicians, because I wanted to speak to women who are actually heavily involved in communities. And then 7 focus groups with women all around Northern Ireland who would access community groups. And this is really their voices on what they see as the barriers to them participating in peace building and how women, peace and security could be implemented in Northern Ireland to give them greater access to both the political sphere and to tackle gender-based violence. So, first of all, one thing that really came through was the conservatism that exists in Northern Irish society. And this idea that if you're a woman in a women's group and you have to go to Stormont and lobby Stormont for something, you can't go as a woman lobbying for women's issues. You have to go as women and children. So you position the issue as one that affects families, it affects women and children. And although I'm not critiquing this as a strategy or as an activist strategy, it does work, but it works in the short term. But what might it do in the longer term? And what I would argue is that it tends to enforce an idea of women within the political sphere as connecting them as mothers and connecting them to children and not as autonomous agents in their own right. And where that may become then really problematic is, and Fiona will talk to this, is if we're arguing for abortion rights. If women are wholly conceived as being mothers, we have a very specific idea of women's role in society. And this was something that came up a lot through the religion, the patriarchy, the heaviness of ethno-national identity, and how that leaves you a very small space to argue for women's rights, and they have to be connected. Oh, already? Okay. In a very specific way. This very, very heavily came through. The idea of ethno-national or ethno-religious identity as a framework for arguing for rights. So this was a quote from one participant who was working with BME communities, Black and Ethnic Minority. What they had wanted to do was to set up a system whereby BME communities could come into a room such as this, and they would have politicians, and they would ask questions, and they would learn about politics, and they would get to talk about their issues. And they had the programme all set up, ready to go. They thought they had funding. It turned out not enough unionist politicians signed up, so the funding was dropped. And their issue was, why, for something that was supposed to benefit a particular community, did we have to still work within the Protestant and Catholic framework? You know, it's not our fault not enough union. We asked them all, they didn't sign up to it. So this idea that continually when you're trying to frame an issue, if you don't have the Protestant and Catholic issue dealt with, it doesn't matter if you want to talk about women, BME communities, sexuality, disability, poverty. It has to be framed through this power-sharing Catholic Protestant framework. This is, again, another framing issue, the idea of a gendered perspective on peace and security. So this participant was talking about the gender equality strategy, and her critique was that the gender equality strategy talks about women's inequality, but it doesn't talk about peace and conflict. So it separates women's issues from those of peace, conflict and security. And it says so there are issues with women's disadvantage in employment, in education, we take positive actions, but it's completely separate from the idea of peace and security. So there's somewhere where you could use a women, peace and security framework within a gender equality strategy to very much locate women in the peace and security talks. Am I giving you all enough time to read these? I'm sort of going quite quickly because I only have 5 minutes, but I can share the slides. And then really, this was something, it didn't come out as much. And it was the idea of what marginalised identities. And women did refer to class. Class was often referred to, particularly by loyalist women. Loyalist women felt that they were very much, from unionist politicians, they saw as being middle class, and that there was a big class divide between unionist politicians and loyalist communities. But class was referred to as an identity that was completely elided from any sort of discussions of peace and security, and the communities that are most affected by conflict, those being working class communities, and not necessarily huge amounts of difference potentially between Republican and loyalist working class communities and the effect. Hello, come on in. And then the other issue being that, for example, lesbian women are a marginalised group both within the gay community and within women's groups. So I think Steffi, who's just walked in, I think is doing some work on lesbian women and peace building. So there is work going on to try and bring out these marginalised voices within the peace building sphere. But generally, when you talk about women and peace, you're not talking about lesbian or gay women. So again, they're a marginalised community within this. Again, abortion as an equality and peace and security issue, only one participant raised that with me as a peace and security potential issue. So these again are things that are marginalised within the women's sphere and within the framework. And then finally, just to come back to our theme of our conference, people saw women, peace and security as a way of actually implementing the Good Friday Agreement. So if you think about where women are mostly located, it potentially is within the civil society sphere. So if we take the idea of inclusion of women in peace and security, and women mostly being located in the civil society sphere, and we think then about the civic forum, which was a key part of the Good Friday Agreement and was completely lost and marginalised, we can use something like a women, peace and security framework to argue for the reinstatement of a civic forum, and that for that to be an arena where women's voices could be heard more prominently. Okay, and this is just a nice one to end on. A lot of people said the problem really is that women know they have a place in peace and security discussions and in these discussions of dealing with the past, but they're not necessarily sure how to argue that position that they should be there, because they constantly come up against the, well, you weren't a combatant, so you're not a peace builder. So a lot of people felt the idea of 1325 actually at its very root should be as an educational tool for women to then be able to argue the right to be in a space and to argue that through an international framework. Okay, so basically the core argument then being that we need to look at in a very deep contextual way at how we would implement the women, peace and security narrative in Northern Ireland. The women's sector did do a large-scale overview consultation with women in 2013, 2014, and I was a note taker at all of those sessions all around Northern Ireland. And although they were great, they were really great at getting issues out there, and there's been a document made, sent to the UK government. Within that, there's still, the word abortion is not in that document, the word lesbian is not in that document. You still have marginalised identities. When you speak to women, there are people who are excluded from peace and security talks. So the idea of having a very deep contextual understanding of the society and what is impeding women from participating in peace and security discussions and peace and security issues needs to be more at the forefront of any discussion of implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Next up we have Dr. Fiona Bloomer, who is a lecturer in social policy at Ulster University. Her research centres on gender issues, with a particular focus on reproductive health, including abortion policy, abortion stigma, abortion as a workplace issue, and female genital mutilation. She is currently a co-investigator on a Global Challenges Research Fund, a reproductive justice framework in the Philippines and South Africa. Fiona is a founding member of the Reproductive Health Law and Policy Advisory Group and a member of RAARN, RAN?
RAN, yeah.
The Reproductive Activism and Abortion Rights Network, a global network of academics and activists.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. A little bit of personal reflection. 20 years ago, I was actually based in the research unit of the Central Secretariat, which then became part of OFM-DFM. I was responsible for doing research on community relations initiatives in schools to see did they have any effect on the children and young people. And as part of that then, OFM-DFM funded me to do my PhD at Ulster University in the psychology department. And I used contact theory to assess the impact of those initiatives on children and young people. And 20 years later, I'm back using contact theory again to see what we can learn from it and how we deal with people's attitudes to abortion. Okay, so a little reminder of the background in terms of the context. Access to abortion. Abortion law in Northern Ireland is highly restricted. It's based on the Offences Against the Persons Act of 1861 and case law. It's highly restricted and it's interpreted as well in a very restrictive way. In the last reported year, there were 16 legal abortions carried out in Northern Ireland on the NHS, and in contrast to that, over 700 travelled to England to access abortion services there. Others are thought to travel further afield, and others self-abort at home. I think it's important to flag up to the difficulties for some individuals in travelling. If you're in a situation of domestic abuse, if you have restricted movement in terms of refugee and asylum seekers, or if you have difficulty getting off work. So the UN Committee on Discrimination Against Women conducted an inquiry which was published just a matter of months ago, and they highlighted a number of grave, what they refer to as grave and systematic violation of human rights. So they noted, for instance, there was a chilling effect on clinicians because of the unclear law and policy. In particular, they noted that the 2013 draft guidance that had been issued by the Department of Health for health professionals was really problematic and caused clinicians actually to fear for carrying out abortions in case they were faced with legal action. Access to abortion services and reproductive health services generally is also impacted by anti-abortion protesters, and there's been a lack of distinct police action in dealing with those protesters outside clinics. There's a don't ask, don't tell approach amongst the health professionals. So if you're a young woman who's taken abortion medication that you've maybe got off the internet, you're fearful that you're hemorrhaging too much, you go to your local hospital, the health professionals are reluctant to ask, have you taken this medication? And you're encouraged that you don't have to disclose that. And that's actually within the guidelines, the don't ask, don't tell approach. There's no referral pathway for post-abortion care if you travel and then return to Northern Ireland. And in cases of fetal remains, so perhaps if you had termination on the grounds of fetal abnormality and that occurred in England and you wanted to travel home and you wanted those fetal remains tested for genetic issues, again there's no referral pathway for that. And the lead paediatric pathologist for Northern Ireland actually resigned 2 years ago in the wake of a number of unending cases that she was having to deal with and the lack of structural support. So she tells a story, for instance, of having to advise a man what was the best type of icebox, picnic icebox, that he could buy, that he could use to transport the fetal remains home. And so there are some of the extreme cases that we hear about in the media. And also then there's been criminalisation of those who seek to self-abort. Added to that is the very stigmatised way in which our politicians talk about abortion. So Claire and I have conducted a study which looked at how abortion has been dealt with in the Northern Ireland Assembly from 1998 onwards. And if you look at that, you'll see, particularly in the early days, that politicians talked about essentially what we refer to as the bad women, the women who were making decision to terminate the pregnancy as a result of their social lives or aspiring to have good careers, and they referred to these women essentially as being bad. And if we fast forward then to 2013, that dialogue changes, and instead of bad women, it's mad women. These women who are vulnerable, who are incapable of making a decision and about whether to terminate their pregnancy or not. And that's essentially how the political dialogue has changed over that period of time. So within that context then, 5 trade unions, Unite, Unison, Mandate, GMB and CW Ireland, decided to commission research to determine, is abortion a workplace issue? They had anecdotal reports of women returning to work too soon or experiencing stigma in the workplace, and they wanted to know, is there actually clear evidence of this? And so they commissioned a study which was conducted in Ireland, North and South, to explore these issues, but also to explore trade union members' views on abortion to determine, did the trade union movement have enough of an evidence base for the movement itself to support legal reform? So for instance, to support the reform for the repeal of the 8th referendum. The research team then involved in the project were myself, my colleague Joanne Devlin-True, Claire Pearson, who's here today, Noreen McNamara, who's here today, and Danielle Mackle. And between us then we conducted a study. So the aim of it was to determine trade union members' views on abortion, their views on legislative reform, and is abortion a workplace issue? Now, to our knowledge, this is the first study exploring abortion as a workplace issue in the world. So the library team at Ulster University, I think that I kind of sent them into a spin on one occasion and asked them, I had looked, I couldn't find any studies, and 3 different members of their team also scanned every bit of published literature and couldn't find another study. So to our knowledge, it's the first of its kind. Colleagues in Poland have just replicated the study, and they're doing the analysis at the minute of that. So the study, we had ethical approval from Ulster University. It was a mixed method study. We had over 3,000 respondents to an online survey, and then of those respondents we asked, would they be willing to take part in an online discussion forum? And the online discussion forum ran for a period of 6 weeks. All the members who took part in that, they were assigned their own individual anonymous names. And the process worked where the research team would ask them an open-ended question. We pitched it almost like an online focus group. So an open-ended question, the group would discuss it amongst themselves. Occasionally the research team would intervene, asking for clarification or to direct people back to the main purpose of the study. And we then have conducted a thematic analysis of the transcripts of that, and that'll be the main focus of today's paper. But just to give you a flavour of that, we have, of the respondents then, 20% said that they had direct experience of abortion as a workplace issue. And the issues related to disclosure, advice and support, time off and sick pay. So I'm going to pick out some of the quotes on those particular issues. So for instance, this one from a female who lived in Northern Ireland. My colleague underwent the procedure. When she returned to work, she spent her lunchtimes crying. She was unable to perform well. She should have had longer off, but she was worried essentially about the vulnerability of her employment position. Another one, and this was someone who had a diagnosis of fetal abnormality, and she very much focuses on, I didn't want to disclose, I didn't feel I had to justify why I took that decision, but also I was nervous about the judgment that would be placed on me because of that. And the thing that really sticks out for me there is that she talks about how she told senior management that she had lost her baby, and this is likely to have been a pregnancy at 20 weeks plus, so a significant period on in terms of the gestation. And she was put under a lot of pressure to return to work early. And they told her, if you come back to work early, we will organise support for you and advice. And she returned to work early, and they didn't do anything. So that was, a clear position then with their feeling in terms of their duties and their duty of care. Another example, I worked with a colleague who made the decision to have an abortion. They did not disclose it to our employer. They took sick leave to travel. And the person talks about the associated stigma in terms of talking about abortion. Very few people will go to their employer and tell them why they need time off. And this then adds to the pressure, constructing that cover story of why you're travelling and making all those arrangements, worrying you're going to get called out, that you're sitting at the airport and you see somebody and you then have to explain why you're travelling. And somebody then talking about the advice and support then, that they feel that because of the legality of the situation at the minute, there's not possibility then to actually access advice and support. To give you a sense of some of the wide range of views that we had on abortion, so you'll see the first one there, any woman who has an abortion should be publicly whipped. People talking about how I'm personally pro-life, but I wouldn't stand in the way of anybody who had an abortion. And also someone talking about highlighting, we're supposed to be this developed society. We don't even talk about miscarriage and abortion just as such a stigmatised thing of our repressed society. One thing that we noticed at the end of the project was that some of the participants strongly articulated that they had, as a result of taking part in the online discussion forum, had gained new insight into abortion and the direct experiences, but also that some people had actually changed their position on abortion purely as a result of taking part in the research project. So we wanted then to see, well, can we apply contact theory to that? Contact theory being the basic, I suppose, easiest way to interpret is if you bring people together from opposing positions and you provide certain conditions that they're of equal status, that they're pursuing a common goal, then it's possible to actually challenge some of the stigma that the groups may hold. And that was, we wanted to test that in terms of abortion stigma. So abortion stigma being this negative attribute that is ascribed to a woman to seek to terminate a pregnancy that marks them either internally or externally as inferior to the ideals of womanhood. So we had 3 different types of experience then on the forum. We had some people who had previous personal experience. So they talked about, I used to be really anti-abortion until, and it was someone they loved had gone through it and experienced the stigma. Individual to individual interaction. So, people talking about their individual experiences and someone saying, I'm glad you shared that story with me. I now understand the situation. And then people saying at the end, well, I've listened to a range of stories and now I can, see a different perspective on this. But the one we were really interested in was a recognition of issues from someone who hadn't thought about the issues before and had articulated, I can now see there's a change. So I picked out the case study of John, and John was anti-abortion, had very strong conservative views on a range of issues. So, he essentially articulates abortion shouldn't be used unless the mother's life is at risk. Don't engage in sex with your husband if you don't want to have a baby. If a woman is saying, I can't have a child because of socioeconomic reasons, she should just get married because apparently marriage solves all your economic problems. And abortion being used as birth control, so that myth of abortion as contraception. He was also very strong on the position of trade unions. Trade unions should not be involved in this. This is a private matter between husband and wife, and the trade union has no role actually to play in that. It's, trade union should not be intervening in the private life of its membership. So during the 6 weeks, John interacted at length with people who were from a pro-choice position, but also from an anti-abortion position. And he certainly wasn't with others who had more extreme views than him on abortion. But at the end of the 6 weeks, he articulated, personally, although I abhor abortion, I think the woman worker is fully entitled to full union protection after she has finished her deed. There is no point in compounding an already difficult scenario. So he had moved from this position of, I really don't like abortion, the union has no role to play in it, and after 6 weeks recognising actually this is a workplace issue and unions do have a role to play in it. So our preliminary analysis then of the material indicates that there were instances of those who were hostile to abortion mediating their views on it, and our theory is it can be ascribed to contact conditions, because largely in the forum there wasn't a hierarchy of views. We managed the discussion so that certain people didn't dominate or didn't use inflammatory language. They were pursuing the common goal of understanding what the issues were, and wider societies generally supportive of the position of abortion reform. However, institutional support is problematic. If we take Northern Ireland, for instance, we know that the Northern Ireland Assembly is not particularly keen on any widespread reform of the Northern Ireland law. And so the extent to which that impact will actually last over time is unknown. So for someone like John, who's very strongly anti-abortion, has now been presented with these alternative views is rethinking his position. How long that rethinking lasts and whether it's a long-term position is unknown. Some reflections then on the research approach. Using the online forum we thought was conducive to this to contact theory conditions. Using the online forum has actually created a very safe space. You know, if anybody did say something that we thought was completely inappropriate, we immediately intervened, deleted the post, and said if you reword that, you can post again, but we're not allowing you to kind of repeat that behaviour. So we were very confident we'd created a safe space, and a number of people said that and said, thank you for allowing me to take part in this project, because I've learned from it and you've created a good environment for us. The research process itself was resource intensive, so there was at least 2 moderators on and normally 3, and we had to have a rota, you know, so that ran for a series of weeks. Flexibility was needed. We didn't know how many of those 3,000 participants were actually going to take part in the forum, and we didn't want to turn anybody away, and we didn't know how well engaged they were going to be either. We also had some IT spec issues. We tested one forum, which was recommended to us, and it just didn't work at all. So the one that we used was high security and had good download requirements, which was important. And so the final comment then, we would argue that the research process has provided an innovative way to engage with diverse groups of participants on a stigmatised issue in a safe space, and contact theory has allowed us to provide some insight to explain that re-evaluation of views. What emerged from the study is that abortion and abortion reform is a crucial issue in the north of Ireland and in the south of Ireland, and the lack of action from governments has quite clearly in Northern Ireland resulted in grave and systematic human rights violations. And as the trade union movement is the largest civil organisation in Ireland with over 700,000 individuals, it can play a key role and has led the way in funding this study to help inform wider societal views of abortion and highlighting the need for improved access to abortion and legal reform. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Pat. Next up we have Noreen McNamara, who completed her doctorate in 2016 on political subjectivity, responsiveness and futurity in the work of Judith Butler and Brasha Ettinger. Since then, she has worked as a research assistant on projects related to reproductive justice and rights. She is currently researching the intersections between theoretical perspectives on political subjectivities, coalitional politics, and reproductive justice.
Thank you. Hello, how are you? Thanks, Claire and Fiona. Those are fascinating presentations. I'm unfortunately going to read from the page. I apologise in advance. And I'm going to talk about newly arrived communities in Northern Ireland and not so newly arrived communities, and how a recent study Claire, Danielle and I, and led by Fiona, did on communities tackling FGM as kind of an example of some of the challenges faced by Black and minority ethnic communities in Northern Ireland. So this paper centres on the findings of a recent study which sought to, firstly, estimate the number of women and girls affected or potentially affected by FGM in Northern Ireland, and secondly, to identify appropriate service provisions, levels or lack thereof. The study was commissioned by the African and Caribbean Support Organisation Northern Ireland, ONeill, funded by the Rosa Foundation UK, and undertaken by this team led by Fiona. So we further situate the findings of this study in the context of a wider challenges faced by newly arrived communities, given the historical, legislative and policy contexts with respect to Black and minority ethnic communities and respect to wider gender norms. Drawing on qualitative data collected in the ONeill study, this paper explores how the barriers identified with regard to communities tackling FGM highlight 3 of the challenges newly arrived communities face, namely the under-resourcing of community networks, gaps in service provider knowledge and training, and language barriers. In a recent article, Let Them Fend for Themselves, Immigration, Race Relations and the State in 20th Century Northern Ireland, Jack Crangle reminds us that the first basic protections for ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland was only introduced in 1997. Prior to this, quote, employment, housing and services could be refused on the basis of skin colour with no prospect of legal redress, end quote. Given the sectarian politics which dominated, Northern Ireland was exempted from successive British race relations acts, and immigrants had little access to services such as language classes, interpreting services and social security. Although early advocates of the Race Relations Act 1965 in Britain wanted to include Northern Ireland, Ulster officials consistently opposed this, deeming it unnecessary as racism did not exist in Northern Ireland. Crangle notes that debates on this issue in Northern Ireland garnered cross-party support for this idea of racism and marginalisation of ethnic communities as a non-existent problem. This presumed lack of racism was largely attributed to the small number of immigrants. As Crangle notes, this perpetuated the myth that, quote, migrant settlement rather than white prejudice causes racism. This no problem here attitude with regard to racism persisted through the 80s and 90s. Although numbers within the ethnic minority communities were relatively small, Crangle estimates that by the 1970s, Belfast was home to several hundred Chinese migrants, and the South Asian population numbered around 1,000. Although precise figures are difficult to obtain since ethnic minority identity was not recorded in the census until 2001. Opposition to the British Race Relations Law extended to Northern Ireland was variously framed throughout the 60s as a defence of Northern Ireland's constitutional rights, with Stormont responsible for Home Affairs, as ideological, which manifested in scorn for the idea that discrimination could be ended through legislation, and as more fundamental, related to the fear that such legislation might also cover the campaign for Catholic civil rights. After direct rule, race rarely entered into public debate, and the status quo suited Westminster, which continued to accept the claim that Northern Ireland had no race relations problem. However, this was increasingly disputed by organisations such as the Multicultural Resource Centre and NISM, which were founded directly to challenge this. The peace process also brought a framing of cultural pluralism and the recognition that multiple groups lived and needed to be accommodated in the region, and this built momentum in favour of anti-racist legislation. Increasing evidence was provided, which proved Northern Ireland did in fact have a problem, and so arguments about racism not being an issue could no longer be dismissed. The 1997 order brought Northern Ireland in line with the rest of the UK, and although the region continued to lag slightly behind the rest of the UK in terms of amendments, Northern Ireland is now fully signed up to the principles of racial equality law. Furthermore, as Claire Pearson notes, post-agreement Northern Irish macro-level politics has, quote, deprioritised gendered concerns, including the representation of women and eradication of gender-based violence, whilst in certain cases, in particular on abortion and sexuality rights, has actively blocked progressive legislation, end quote. Substantive equality for women is undervalued, and this has particular consequences for the concerns and priorities of black and minority ethnic women who face significant barriers in accessing education, paid employment, adequate healthcare and secure legal status. So, a recent study on asylum seekers and refugee experiences of life in Northern Ireland found that they continue to face numerous challenges, including poor or no legal support during the asylum process, limited information on needs and rights, substandard housing, frequent housing moves, poor or little support during the transition period from asylum seeker to refugee status, being fearful of making complaints to public officials as this may impede a claim, serious lack of support for dealing with mental health issues, little support in terms of employment and the recognition of skills and credentials, a lack of English classes and lack of information on health services. In 2012, the Women's Intercultural Network, WIN, was formed within Axoni as a platform for black and minority ethnic women to connect, set priorities and have a voice in Northern Irish society. One of the major issues WIN wanted to prioritise was the awareness of FGM, and so Axoni commissioned this scoping study as part of that. The Somali Women's Support Action Network, SWAN, have been actively working on raising awareness of FGM in Northern Ireland since 2015. Founded by Sarah Balbal, they worked entirely on a voluntary basis until very recently when they received a small grant of about £10,000 from the National Lottery. FGM is internationally recognised as a form of gender-based violence, a form of child abuse and a human rights violation. It is considered a hidden practice due to the taboo associated with the practice and the cultural sensitivities involved in speaking out against it. Best practice policy and project guidelines on tackling FGM are very clear on the need for a community-led, human rights and do no harm approach, which centres women and girls and involves wider stakeholders. So within the UK, the NHS estimates that approximately 137,000 women and girls are affected by FGM. The research team were unable to estimate the number of women affected in Northern Ireland. We sought to obtain data from the Northern Ireland census detailing the number of residents by country of birth resident in Northern Ireland in 2011, alongside the percentages of girls and women aged 15 to 49 who have undergone FGM from those countries to date. However, we determined that in all but 5 of the countries concerned, the number of people living in Northern Ireland from these countries was less than 100. In addition, we were unable to obtain detailed, robust data on immigration since 2011 during the period of our study. Ethically, we believe it will be inappropriate to publish data estimating the numbers affected by FGM, particularly as this might lead to individual members of communities affected being identified. We thus recommended that this matter of prevalence await further consideration by the Safeguarding Board subgroup, which is currently considering matters related to FGM. So within the UK, FGM has been illegal since 1985, that act was replaced in 2003, which was then further amended by the Serious Crime Act 2015. Under these provisions, it is illegal to perform FGM by a UK national or a person who is resident in the UK, or to assist a non-UK person to perform FGM to a UK national or a person who is habitually resident in the UK. The 2015 Act also creates a new offence of failing to protect a girl under 16 from FGM, and it creates a mandatory duty for specified regulated professionals, a mandatory reporting duty for specified regulated professionals in England and Wales, but not in Northern Ireland. Cooperating to safeguard children and young people in Northern Ireland provides the overarching policy framework for safeguarding children and young people. Within this framework, where any individual or organisation has a concern that a child may be at immediate risk of FGM, they must report it to the PSNI immediately, and a referral to the relevant Health and Social Care Trust must be made. Practitioners must also comply with the multi-agency practice guidelines on female genital mutilation, any professional guidance on FGM issued by their professional body, and their internal organisational policies, procedures and guidance. So currently the Safeguarding Board's FGM subgroup is focusing its effort on 3 areas of work and is due to present its findings later this year. The 3 areas are pathways for victim survivors in relation to post-trauma issues, engagement and support of communities, and improved data collection systems. So the scoping study conducted 15 semi-structured interviews with representatives from relevant statutory and voluntary organisations and NGOs. So findings include a serious concern about the lack of data on the prevalence of FGM. This led to assumptions being made that the issue was not being taken seriously by government. The absence of data also contributed to an absence of the development of specific services for those at risk and for survivors. Stakeholders who were aware of the multi-agency guidelines issued by the Department of Finance stated that they had been well received, although there is insufficient information on the options available for women over 18 years of age. Stakeholders expressed serious concern about the lack of an implementation plan for the multi-agency guidelines and the absence of a departmental body to lead on this. Stakeholders identified that recording mechanisms were in place for FGM, however it is unclear what the outcomes of recording cases was in the health service. They identified that specific training was needed in the health sector, including equipping staff with the skills to complete accurate diagnostic drawings of FGM, and training was also needed on how to discuss FGM and how to respond to it in a culturally appropriate manner. Concern was also expressed at significant gaps in terms of service provision for survivors of FGM. Health professionals are unclear what services exist and what is needed by girls and women. The impact of the absence of specialist care could lead to further physical and mental health problems. In addition, a gap in the services and funding for communities in terms of raising awareness was identified. Stakeholders identified that whilst community groups are trying to lead on this issue, an absence of resources restricted their efforts. It was argued that it is vital for statutory agencies to support initiatives which enable affected communities to raise awareness of FGM. As part of the scoping study, The views of affected communities were also explored in a focus group facilitated by Saria Khalifa in partnership with Mutasa Lachum from Axoni. Women participating in the focus group noted that they all knew FGM was part of their culture, even though they rarely spoke about it within their families. Reasons for FGM were stated as protecting honour, ensuring a daughter would get married, and control of sexuality. Many women only realise when they are older that this creates physical and mental health complications. Participants stated that men are often in favour of FGM as they have little awareness of the damage that it brings to women. They believe that a combination of awareness, education and enforcement of the law were needed to change cultural practices. As the cultural shift needed to eradicate FGM must take place from bottom up, spaces for women to share experiences, perspectives, knowledge and strategies is crucial to break down societal stigma. Whilst participants highlighted that practitioner knowledge and safeguarding is improving, they also felt that there are gaps in awareness of FGM and in service provision for women. Language and cultural barriers were mentioned several times as impediments to open discussions. Participants also noted that over-response on occasion could risk alienating communities. The scoping study thus delivered 7 key recommendations. So the first one was the stress to human rights-based do no harm community-led approach, the implementation plan for the multi-agency guidelines, a comprehensive data collection strategy, regional multi-agency awareness training, awareness raising and training, a deeper understanding of professionals' awareness and views around the issue, and focus on support, care and protection for women and girls at risk, and also for survivors of FGM. Engagement with communities was the 7th recommendation, and we stressed that it should be done in a culturally sensitive manner, and community champions are central to this. Community champions should be from the affected communities and should be provided with appropriate resources and support to enable effective programme delivery. So the issue of raising awareness of and the prevention of FGM highlights 3 barriers particularly faced by newly arrived communities. These are the under-resourcing of community networks, gaps in public and voluntary service provider knowledge and training, and language barriers. These societal barriers negatively impact on the lives of Black and minority ethnic women in particular. There is also the sense that because the numbers affected are relatively small, and perhaps because it also primarily affects women, that this issue is not taken seriously enough. Policy and political initiatives in Northern Ireland have moved on and now fully acknowledge that racism and the marginalisation of Black and minority ethnic communities is a real problem which must be tackled in a holistic manner. Unfortunately, much remains to be done in terms of the implementation of legislation and policy frameworks. Health, alongside employment, housing, education, social bridges, language, cultural knowledge, rights and citizenship are key indicators of integration. Furthermore, integration is a two-way process which was focused both on newcomers and on the host community. This two-way process occurs in stages, with long-term integration impacted on by the early stages of arrival and reception. It is essential that affected communities are no longer left to fend for themselves, and holistic supports are developed and made available from when an individual first arrives or seeks asylum. So, and then, any else?
So thank you. Our final speaker can't be here, so I'm gonna have someone read the paper very kindly. But I'll give the bio as though she were here. Daniel Mackle is a research associate at Ulster University, working on various research projects including access to fertility treatment for lesbian and bisexual women in Northern Ireland, FGM in Northern Ireland, and an all-Ireland trade union survey on abortion attitudes. Danielle's PhD has explored the human development and well-being of the LGBT community in Northern Ireland. This research has highlighted the negative impact that moral conservatism within politics and policy development has had on the well-being of the LGBTQ community.
Me again, sorry. So Danielle can't be here, unfortunately, so I said I'd read out her paper. So this paper will offer a brief historical overview of the LGBT community in Northern Ireland since homosexuality was decriminalised in 1982. It will then present a summary of the advancements in the equality legislation since the Good Friday Agreement. The paper will use data taken from a PhD study which has explored the human development and well-being of the LGBT community in Northern Ireland. This data will be used to discuss the impact of equality legislation in practice. Further, it will highlight the gaps that remain in terms of equality legislation and policy and practice in relation to the LGBT community in Northern Ireland. So firstly, she's going to talk about a brief historical overview. So given the difficult political and social context in Northern Ireland over the 3 decades of the Troubles, and indeed since, it is unsurprising that the inequalities impacting on Northern Ireland's minority communities remained unresolved and did not progress at the same rates as the rest of the UK. Examples of this include decriminalising homosexuality, legislating for same-sex marriage, banning the blood ban, and legislating for same-sex adoption in line with England, Scotland and Wales. Indeed, it was 13 years after England and Wales decriminalised homosexuality in 1969 that this legislative reform reached Northern Ireland. There was fierce opposition to the decriminalisation, which was mounted by the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, then leader of the Democratic Unionist Party and the head of the Free Presbyterian Church. Paisley spearheaded the Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign, and it was not until LGBT activist Jeff Dudgeon brought a case to the European Court of Human Rights in 1981 that decriminalisation occurred. This repeal did not bring equal rights for the LGBT community in Northern Ireland, and the community suffered in terms of exclusion from mainstream society, enduring cultural and social discrimination, homophobic and transphobic attacks and violence. Indeed, research by Hayes and Nagel highlights that homophobic and transphobic prejudice and violence has become a common feature of societies emerging from violence and protracted conflict. The journey to equality has been difficult for the Northern Irish LGBT community, who have had to further endure discrimination from many sources. This has included deeply offensive comments made by elected political representatives, the most infamous of which came from DUP MP Iris Robinson, who stated in 2008 that being gay was an abomination and nauseating and was worse than paedophilia. Despite these difficulties, there have been advancements in the equality legislation pertaining to the LGBT community. So advancements in legal equality came about with the enactment of the Northern Ireland Act 1998. Under Section 75 of this Act, which requires statutory bodies to promote equality of opportunity and good relations, the LGBT community was, for the first time, included as a minority group, requiring legal recognition in the legislation. Subsequent legislation has further sought to address the gaps in terms of legislative inequalities, and the LGBT community in Northern Ireland have some protection under the legislation. Since 2002, under the Employment Northern Ireland Order, same-sex parents have the same right to parental and adoption leave as their heterosexual peers. In 2003, the Employment Equality Regulations made it illegal for an employer to discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation. In 2004, the Civil Partnership Act afforded same-sex couples the right to legal recognition of their relationship. In 2006, the Equality Act Regulations Northern Ireland made it unlawful for any business to discriminate against LGBT people in the provision of goods, facilities and services. In 2013, Article 15 of the Adoption Northern Ireland Order was amended to include same-sex couples, allowing same-sex couples the right to adopt children. It is important to note that the Civil Partnership Act in 2004 came about during a period of direct rule from Westminster. Whether or not the Northern Ireland Assembly would have passed this act is unclear. Northern Ireland now remains the only part of the British Isles not to extend equal marriage to its LGBT citizens. Same-sex marriage equality has been debated 5 times in the Northern Ireland Assembly. The Green Party brought the first vote on same-sex marriage legislation to the Assembly in 2012, and on 5 occasions since 2013, Sinn Féin has tabled this vote for the Assembly. The most recent vote in 2016 saw a small majority in favour for the first time. However, by activating a petition of concern, the DUP has exercised its right to block legislation designed to further equality for the LGBT community. The petition of concern is a device which was intended to protect communal interests, but has been used to restrict movement on social issues. The DUP cited their key reason for opposition to marriage equality as their fear that it would undermine the traditional nuclear notion of the family, a a position common to the Catholic Church and most Protestant denominations in Northern Ireland. However, following the Northern Ireland Assembly elections in March 2017, due to a significant loss of seats, the DUP lost the power to raise a petition of concern. A valid petition requires 30 Assembly members' signatures, and in the previous mandate, the DUP, with 38 seats, was the only party that could table a petition as a standalone party. To again veto this issue of equal marriage, the DUP would have to find support from others in the chamber to reach the required 30 signatures now. The likelihood is that they would approach one or more of the other unionist parties who are also against same-sex marriage to fill in the remaining signatures. In terms of marriage equality, Northern Ireland is very much a jurisdiction out on its own. Equality for the LGBT community remains steadfastly behind that of the other UK regions. Opinion polls have shown, however, that Stormont and the DUP in particular are out of step with the opinions of the electorate as a whole. In July 2015, an Ipsos Mori survey showed that 7 out of 10 people in Northern Ireland are in favour of equal marriage. Further, an estimated 20,000 people took part in a pro-marriage equality march in Belfast, organised by Amnesty International, the Rainbow Project and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions in 2015. It is unlikely that marriage equality, as with the implementation of the Civil Partnership Act in 2004, will be sought through direct rule from Westminster. There has been hope among the LGBT community that marriage equality could have been sought through the court process. 2 separate cases were taken to the High Court, one by a lesbian couple and a gay couple who were challenging the Northern Ireland government's refusal to legislate for same-sex marriage. The second case was by a couple who had been married in England and who were petitioning to have their marriage legally recognised as one in Northern Ireland. The High Court dismissed both cases, stating that marriage equality was an issue of social policy, and therefore this was a decision for the Northern Ireland Assembly to decide on. It is clear that the LGBT community in Northern Ireland have some protection under the equality legislation. However, they face restrictions in terms of what they can be and do, and further, equality legislation does not always mean equality in practice. This next section will highlight these legislative and policy restrictions, and will use data taken from 35 qualitative interviews with LGBT community participants. This PhD study set out to explore the human development and well-being of the LGBT community in Northern Ireland. So, currently in Northern Ireland, in terms of marriage equality, LGBT individuals cannot enter into a same-sex civil marriage, despite this being available to LGBT individuals in the rest of the UK. In terms of reproductive health, lesbian and bisexual women cannot access fertility treatment on the NHS, unlike their heterosexual counterparts and same-sex couples in the rest of the UK. This situation has led women to take risks in terms of self-arranged conception. Some women are buying and using non-regulated sperm, and this approach also has legal ramifications in terms of the donor legally being able to claim parental responsibility for the child. In terms of feeling safe, research has demonstrated that many LGBT people in Northern Ireland feel they are unsafe, being identified as LGBT in public and report being subjected to verbal or physical abuse. 80% of LGBT community participants from this study noted that they would not show or display any sign of affection with their same-sex partner in public, such as holding their hand in the street or in a restaurant. This clearly identifies that Northern Ireland is not perceived to be a safe place for LGBT people. In terms of health, LGBT participants from this study have identified that they are not offered routine medical screening because of their LGBT identity. For example, lesbian women report that their GPs advised that they do not have to attend for smear screening due to their sexual orientation. According to guidelines published by the British Medical Council, this information is incorrect, and lesbian women are at the same risk of cervical cancer as their heterosexual peers. In terms of employment, many LGBT people fear disclosing their LGBT identity at work, particularly those who work in the private sector in Northern Ireland. LGBT participants disclosed that they felt that they would be targeted, discriminated against by colleagues and management. Further, participants stated that if they did report harassment or workplace bullying to management, they fear that no action would be taken, despite the equality legislation in place to protect LGBT employees. In terms of education, LGBT pupils are not protected under the equality legislation, and many feel unsafe about being identified as LGBT in school. Research has established that schools are not considered public authorities under Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998. Subsequent inquiries with the Department of Education and the Equality Commission have demonstrated that no argument has been made to exempt schools from these obligations. Findings from this study have emphasised the negative experiences of LGBT young people have experienced and continue to experience in schools, especially those individuals identifying as trans, due to the visible nature of gender transition. Participants from this study identified that the fear of bullying or being identified as LGBT caused them to leave school earlier, and this has had an impact on their educational attainment. Currently, schools are not required to reference homophobic or transphobic bullying on their anti-bullying policy. Further, there is no statutory requirement to discuss sexual orientation in relationship and sex education classes. The restrictions placed on the LGBT community are a direct result of their minority sexual orientation and gender identity. LGBT community activists and stakeholders have called on government to advance legislation and policy in terms of equality for the LGBT community in Northern Ireland, so that they can lead the kind of lives they have reason to value. Nussbaum, 2001, a proponent of human development and well-being, suggests that, quote, the state holds a clear responsibility to bolster appropriate concern for groups among the populace where it has previously been lacking, end quote. However, findings from this study would suggest that this is not the case in Northern Ireland. To conclude, it is clear that there have been developments in the equality legislation since the Good Friday Agreement, and this has led to a greater recognition of and protection for LGBT people. Based on this most recent study of well-being, however, it appears that much more needs to be done at government and institutional level to advance the human development and well-being of the LGBT community. Research continues to demonstrate that the issue of social exclusion, physical and verbal abuse and violence, inequalities in health and education, and minority oppression does not vanish because of legislative change. Although there has been an increase in society's tolerance of sexual orientation and gender identity diversity, the research highlights the continued reporting of inequalities and injustices within institutions. While legislative policy and societal progress has been made in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, the LGBT community's journey to equality continues in Northern Ireland.
Fantastic. Would you like to come up for questions? We have about 15 minutes before a coffee break. Fantastic. Thank you so much for those excellent papers.
Someone wants to start straight away.
Yeah, who would like to?
I just want to jump in. Thank you all for the presentations, especially thanks Noreen for agreeing to it.
Yeah,
It's really important that we hear that as well. There's quite a lot of fairly damning and negative findings in all of the presentations. How receptive have policymakers been to your results and the results of your studies of the research? Do you feel that because you are making policy recommendations, it's a pretty open question, but how receptive do you feel that policymakers are to your studies and your findings?
I would certainly, I know I presented a pretty bleak picture of the Northern Ireland Assembly, particularly in abortion. I think it's important to say that there have been movements, and certain political figures are definitely on a journey. I think it's the best way to describe in terms of, for instance, their approach on abortion. So if you take Naomi Long as an example of that, leader of the Alliance Party. So if you look back maybe 5-10 years ago, she would have been very cautious about what she said in public about her position on abortion. But the Alliance Party now generally as a whole are moving, progressively forward in terms of abortion and the need for widespread reform. Claire Bailey has been brilliant from the Green Party in kind of supporting reform. Stephen Agnew as well at the Green Party. When Dawn Purvis was there, so there have been some individuals who are receptive. Claire and I, along with a colleague at Queen's, Catherine McNeely, held a
closed session?
A closed session in the Assembly about 2 years ago, 18 months ago maybe. We were told actually there was one member of the SDLP wanted to attend, and it was very clear. We said, we're not reporting on this. This is a briefing session. We're going to, it was related to the judicial review case and the consideration of fatal abnormality. And we were told, I received a phone call from one SDLP member saying, I'd really like to come, but I can't even be seen being in the same room to discuss this. Other members were there. I mean, there were certainly members of the UUP and the Alliance Party, and there was a range of. So I think behind closed doors, there's definitely a sense that people are receptive and listening to the evidence, but publicly, some of them remain very hostile to it. So it's been a mixed bag. Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted other people to answer as well.
No, it's okay, that's...
First of all, I wanted to say thanks a million. You've made my year actually, because I don't often get to hear people talk about the issues that I'm also researching. I have two questions. First for Claire, I was so interested in hearing you use the term reproductive violence, and I was just wondering, is it a term that is gaining recognition, or is it something that people still dispute as a concept? And my second question, I think, is a bit of a follow-on from the first about policy makers. It's for you, Fiona, about abortion. I feel a wee bit more optimistic since I heard what you said in the last few minutes, but I've had this feeling that the Assembly will not in my lifetime legalise or decriminalise abortion more fully. Maybe that is wrong to think, if there is kind of movement happening more quietly. But I suppose my kind of big question is, how are we going to make it happen? And if you know that, obviously, well done. But how are we going to move towards that?
Okay.
I'll go first. Yeah, I think actually the term, because of the projects we're working on at the minute, the term reproductive justice is actually gaining more traction.
Yes.
And I think in Ireland it would be a very useful term because it links to maternal violence. So it links to issues such as symphysiotomy. It links to the fact that the 8th Amendment affects maternal rights as well as abortion rights. It links back to mother and baby homes. So the whole reproductive life of a woman it takes into consideration. Reproductive violence is a little bit more narrow and may talk more to state-sanctioned violence, but justice goes a little bit broader and also brings in the idea of reparation from that violence. So I think if you're thinking about looking at that term more, I'd even go further and go for reproductive justice. Yeah.
On the issue of what can we do to move forward, I think the Political Discourse Project that Claire and I looked at when we looked at the first debates in the year 2000. Some of the discourse was absolutely and utterly grim. It really, really was, and it was actually a difficult project to work on. We sat in my office at Jordanstown. Often said I wish the room was soundproofed, because we would look at this. What has he said? And it was how the politicians talked about women with complete and utter kind of disparagement. So I think if you take that and look at where we are now, there's significant improvement. I think a big thing in changing politicians' perspective is listening to women's individual stories. And I think a big part of that changed was when Sarah Ewart came forward to tell her story about being denied a termination on the grounds of fetal abnormality and having to travel. And she very bravely came forward and told her story. And since then, other women have come forward. And I think the politicians are now saying there's more nuance to the debate. It's not simply this black and white issue. It's not a case of deserving and undeserving abortion. There are a myriad of reasons why women might need abortions. I would have to pay credit to the fantastic activists at Alliance for Choice, who have been working solidly for years in kind of challenging the stigma on abortion. They've been doing everything from political lobbying, community-based education programs, going out to women's centres, a stall in Belfast every Saturday afternoon, so they have really led the way. I'm thinking particularly of Emma Campbell, who has been, and Kelly O'Dowd, who have both been really fantastic media figures. I think most people on here may know the Stephen Nolan radio show, and so he goes for the shock tactics. I can't remember what the story was, but a story broke one week about abortion. And if you're invited to go on the Nolan show, you're lucky if you get 10 minutes. That's kind of. And this particular show, Emma Campbell stayed on for an hour and a half, and she dealt with the anti-abortion lobby movement and lots of people who were phoning in, and she just presented really calm, rational. These are the issues. We need to trust women. These women are at the centre of this, and we need to trust them that they're making the best decision for them and their families. So I think in moving the debate forward, the role of Alliance for Choice has been central to that. It really, really has. And I think they've done wonderful work. When they first started, they had an annual budget of something like £300. And they were able to do amazing work on the basis of that. And then they have a fantastic volunteer base, and they've been able to access some grants to actually develop their work further. So I think putting women's voices, that lived experience, at the centre of things, and also they've worked really closely too with the LGBT community and recognising, trans individuals who will also need access to abortion services. So they've worked really hard to be inclusive as well, and I think they've played a significant role in making the wider public think about the issues as well as the politicians.
Do we have Liz and Steffi?
Thanks to all of you for filling papers. I was just wondering, I guess this kind of applies to all of the papers, but this kind of idea in the Northern Ireland Act that there's a statutory duty to conduct a quality impact assessment on all policies. So I was kind of wondering if that's come up in your work as an issue, if there's been kind of a lack of that kind of impact assessment, and if so, how would politicians legitimize that?
Well, I think I suppose it's quite commonly known, or I don't know if it's anecdotally known, that equality is seen in a very simplistic way. Well, you've worked in civil service, so you know better than any of us, but this idea that does this impact men and women equally, it's a very simplistic analysis.
Tick box exercise.
Yeah.
It really, really is. It definitely is, yeah. I should also say I am Danielle Mackles. I'm one of her supervisors for a PhD, so if anybody has any questions on it, I can happily answer them.
My question very much along the same lines, but perhaps just to refine it a bit. First of all, thank you so much for your paper. It's such an important, crucial work you're doing. I'm still a big and outsider to Northern Ireland. I'm constantly and repeatedly shocked by the way things are, and how slowly moving things are, and that it is so difficult to change. And one thing that strikes me teaching at Queen's is always my students' approach to things. So I teach a module on trauma, and so abortion comes in there as well, miscarriages and so on, the joys, incest, and the response I find it's for me it's a traumatic way they actually respond to the text, because they don't want to deal with it, they don't want to talk about it, and there's something, again, this kind of stigma of shame, of silencing, which comes down, and I'm always trying to look for hope and for signs of change. To what extent in your own research do you find that there is actually a generational change? Do the younger people respond differently to it? And is there then a difference as well to the abortion question or the abortion issue and to LGBT things? Because again, I think there LGBT has moved on differently to the abortion issue, which seems very frozen.
Yeah. If we take the issue of young people and abortion, I think you have to first of all take a step back and look at the sex and relationship education that's going on in schools in Northern Ireland, or the lack of. So it's either non-existent, it's patchy, or the very good practice is minimal. There's an organisation called Love for Life, which are anti-abortion. Previously were quite anti-LGBT, but actually have toned down what they used to be like. If you looked at their material about 10 years ago, and I was actually, when I was working at OFMDFM, and I was out visiting somebody in the Northwest Educational Authority, and they were the community relations officer there, and actually presented me with material from Love for Life, because I hadn't encountered them before, and they were saying how really worried they were at that stage about the influence this organisation was having in schools, and they showed me some of their material. So their Love for Life are from this perspective of don't have sex before marriage, contraception isn't really that good for you, you shouldn't have a lot of sexual partners before marriage because your future husband will judge you in that regard. So they have been invited into over 70% of post-primary schools in Northern Ireland to deliver.
Sorry, is it again like both Protestant and Catholic?
Yes. Yeah. And so, I mean, the material that they're delivering in schools of late, and I've had a look at what they're doing in schools, and it's quite tame. A lot of it's about relationships. But when you go on their website, for instance, under crisis pregnancy, if you click on that part of their website, which is directed specifically at teens, it talks about the physical and mental ill effects of having a termination. And the three, it says if you have a crisis pregnancy, you can talk to your GP or one of these three organisations. And the three organisations are all anti-abortion organisations. So I think you have to look at then, so there's that issue. The only other time a young person might actually talk about abortion is doing GCSE religion under the ethics, and then they're presented with, abortion is good or abortion is bad, and they have to decide on the perspective there. So I think unless a young person's been lucky enough that they've had education from Brooke or RFPA, they're presented with this very narrow perspective on abortion. So it might only be then when they actually go to third level education that they're that are asked about it, and some of them just, it's that sense of, I'm afraid of saying I'm not sure what I think about it, but also I don't know what words to use. How do I articulate my perspective? I've only ever come across this very black and white. So I think that's an issue. In terms of generational stuff, I would reflect back on Kelly O'Dowd's work that she did with women who'd been through community education programs, and she would say that you can't make any assumptions on that. That often the older person has lived a life and has seen the consequences of crisis pregnancies or difficulties, and they offer a more nuanced perspective on it. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, given what you said about the work that you've done in Stornham on closed sessions and stuff, do you think in a place like Northern Ireland, with all its nuances and how politicians react to public opinion or don't react to public opinion, or how that dynamic works, would an approach, you think, like the Citizens Assembly, and its relationship down south to the referendum, do you think that kind of approach would work in Northern Ireland, and if so, how would we put that on the table?
I think it would. I followed the referendum, particularly the last 2 weekends, and it was amazing to watch that those, it was 99, that was originally supposed to be 100, people from everyday walks of life, and they were presented with a range of evidence, and they came to the conclusion that widespread reform was needed. And I think they were provided with it in the environment and allowed to debate, see all the nuance to it, and they came to that conclusion. I think it would be wonderful if we had that opportunity in Northern Ireland.
Well, it is coming. It will be coming in the next year.
Yeah, I suppose my question is just because that's so connected to the legislation and decisions on the amendment and the wording, and how we don't have that, we don't have political vacuum or whatever, or how what Danielle's PhD was presenting in terms of how direct rule has taken us a little bit further. Do you think that approach would work given our sort of our political.
I think it would. It's the as you say in the south, there's a clear legislative impetus because it then fed into the Oireachtas Committee, and they then decided forward, and that then helped. In Northern Ireland, we don't have an assembly.
I think the Citizens' Assembly in Northern Ireland will be a tool for direct rule. I think that's what it potentially will be set up to do. It will move legislation forward based on an idea of consensus, because if you try to implement direct rule in the current climate, it's not going to be very popular. But if you have some form of consensus from the citizenry, you are going to move that forward. So I think that is actually potentially, I'm trying to do some research on this at the moment, and I think potentially looking at that, it could be a tool for direct rule to move forward same-sex marriage and abortion legislation.
Sorry. I just want to go back to something that I asked away earlier. I think that's what I meant when I said I didn't see the Assembly doing it in terms of decriminalising or further decriminalising abortion, because of the constitutional structure, the petition of concern, the structure that structurally it's set up against it happening other than via direct rule. So the fact that a Citizens' Assembly might almost be a structural way to take us further to that brings me hope, because I find it such a dilemma to, when I taking it back to the Good Friday Agreement, the idea that 20 years ago actually this was going to happen, we were going to start doing it for ourselves and sharing responsibility for running the country, and then finding myself as a woman going, well actually you can't be trusted with it. So I find myself thinking, well, I don't want you to run the country because you're bad for women, and I just feel like, how do we fix that? I feel torn as someone who wants to see Northern Ireland move forward together, and then thinking, well actually you're only going to move forward for straight white men. Sorry, I know it's not being a question. It's an important issue.
We're due for coffee now, but does anyone have a quick final question? Yeah, well, if you could join me in thanking our speakers. There'll be coffee on the bridge. Thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Sharon.
Thank you.
Yeah.